my name is Beth Manuel, and I'm with the Ann Arbor District Library. I'll be facilitating a discussion today about what is racial trauma for AADL-TV. This talk stemmed from a previous discussion that we had with a couple of our current panelists, but others that were addressing anxiety in the spring and how to cope with it. And then we started to and continue to see demonstrations around the country about the treatment of Black folks and people of color. And so we wanted to specifically address the idea at that time about racial trauma, include that in our discussion, and then today to expound on what racial trauma is and go forward in the discussion. So that's the story behind that. I'd like to introduce our panelists. You can just raise your hand when I call your name. So we have Lauren Tatarsky. She's got a Master of Arts in Spiritual Guidance and from Sophia University, and is a holistic counselor with the sliding scale here in Ann Arbor. Raina LaGrand is a somatic trauma therapist and yoga teacher living in Ann Arbor. She has a diverse background in trauma-informed care and mood disorders. Marna Clowney-Robinson is a clinical social worker and a librarian. As a mental health provider, she specializes in identity issues, eating disorders, and trauma, and she also serves as an access and public services librarian at the University of Michigan. Micah Saniyah uses the pronouns Z, them, there, is a white, queer, non-binary therapist at Integrative Empowerment Group in the Ypsi, Ann Arbor area. Mike is passionate about working with LGBTQIA clients, as well as individuals exploring issues related to self-worth, perfectionism, anxiety, whiteness, and white body supremacy. So we have a great group of panelists, and I thank you all for being here right now. I appreciate it. So let's get started. I think I will start with asking Lauren, what do we mean by the term trauma, and what does it mean by being a trauma-informed practitioner? So let's start with, what is trauma?
So, I think that traditional psychology would call trauma like some form of experiencing some form of deep harm or violence. And I think that many of us would expand now that definition a little bit to be, basically anything that we experience as unsettling to our system. And that actually the experience of trauma, it can be very individual. So somebody can have a shared experience with someone else and they can actually experience it quite differently. And one would call it trauma and one would not. And this has a lot to do with like our DNA, with our experiences as children, with our entire story. So I would say that I actually pulled up a quote from Psychosynthesis, which is some of the spiritual psychology work that I've been trained in. And they call trauma a break in the intricate web of relationships in which we live, move, and have our being. A fundamental trust and connection to the universe, to humanity, is betrayed, and we become strangers to ourselves and others. So that can take many forms, right? And again, it's experienced really individually based on one's history, both ancestrally, both generationally, but also in our own existence and experience. So I think that is a little bit to get us started, and please add if other folks have more to say.
Yeah. Does anyone have anything to add to that definition specifically, or no? Okay.
I thought that was really beautiful framing.
Yeah. Yeah, it made me consider different times that I did experience something unsettling, and I might not have called it a traumatic experience, but really when I think of all that was going on. Anyway, it's just enlightening way to look at it. So what about being a trauma-informed practitioner? What does that entail? Maybe Micah, do you want to talk about that?
So I think trauma informed for me means just being aware of that definition of trauma and how that can show up for folks. I think the difference between being trauma informed and not for me can come up in how I'm perceiving a client's experience. I might be more likely to be asking questions like what has happened in your life that's contributing to the responses that you're having and the things that you're noticing, rather than what's wrong with you. I think that being trauma-informed can help us shift from pathologizing a client into understanding more what their experience has been. And, for me also, it's about recognizing that trauma isn't just something that I'm working with in a client, but like I need to navigate my own experience as well. And if it's in a group setting, doing that with everybody in the group as well. Yeah.
And we've also heard the term generational trauma, and I wondered if one of you would speak to that and what it means and how you identify it, maybe Reina or Marna.
Sure. So when we're talking about generational trauma, I think there's kind of at least a couple different ways that happens. So, if we are living in a world where traumatic experiences are prevalent, right, especially for those of us who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, hold other oppressed identities, the world that we live in is not safe for us, right? And so we have to be consistently kind of adapting to that. And while that's beautiful, right, that we are able to adapt to that, it also means that there's essentially, right, some sort of sacrifice and some sort of impact that happens within our families and within our communities. And so I think we can think about intergenerational trauma both happening sort of on like verbal and the nonverbal sort of subtle levels, the ways that we communicate, the way that we connect with each other, traits that are passed down, right? Resmaa Menakem, one of the, as I was telling you all before this call, one of the leading voices on racialized trauma right now, describes that as sort of like, what did your parents or caregivers lean into and what did they recoil from, right? And then what's the impact on you? So I think that's one way that we experience intergenerational trauma. Another way is through epigenetics. So essentially certain experiences that we have, as well as other things that we're exposed to, right? We know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are often more exposed to, or excuse me, not exposed to environmental toxins, for instance, right? And other sort of environmental things that can have an impact on our gene expression. And then that's also passed down, right? And I think one way you can, that I get a good picture of this is that when someone is pregnant, if they are pregnant with a female fetus, that female fetus already has like all the eggs inside of its body that it's going to have for its body, right? For its life, excuse me. So what that parent experiences has an impact on its grandchildren, right? So there's a couple different ways that intergenerational trauma sort of gets woven and passed down and spread out.
Yeah, it's genetic, not just emotional. Did you have anything to add to that, Marna?
No, I think, Reina spelled it out very precisely, and and she's right that it's just like, when we look at, let's say, certain behaviors or patterns, we can often see a recurrence of it from generation to generation to generation. And it's just like Reina said with the DNA, it's already there, and it's passed down, and we get it when we're born. And it's kind of like if we look at, let's say, a child who grows up in a family where domestic violence is prevalent. They're constantly learning this behavior, and it's going to be passed on until that connection is broken. So, but yeah, I think Reina explained it very, very well. Thank you.
Yeah, all of you.
Yeah. Can I add something? Sorry. I just wanted to add also that another piece of Resmaa Menakem's work too is talking about how our experience of each other is passed down also in white bodies, and that we, like I as a white person, have inherited and genetically and also learned in my families how to interact or not with Black bodies and brown bodies, and that I carry all of that in my system. And so I've been conditioned to see, for example, a Black man is dangerous, and even if I cognitively don't believe that, my body reacts to that messaging in a way that shows it lives in my system. And that's the kind of thing that is also passed down for white folks in terms of racial trauma and racial experiences.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I can see how that would play into it. I just wanted to touch on, with so much going on in the country daily about racism, white supremacy, voter rights, voter suppression, the violent situations that have been put on against Black people and people of color. How have you managed your emotions as therapists, and how do you maintain that kind of stability with so much going on in the world right now? Marna, do you want to?
Sure. The first thing that popped in my mind when you said that was caffeine. No, I think for myself, I make sure I connect with my colleagues, with my community. I see my own therapist and discuss some of the issues that I've experienced, ensuring that I'm not holding it all in, that I am, getting it out so that it is not going to manifest into any other stressors, any anxieties, or anything like that. But that works for me. It's doing things with my community, doing things with people that I care about, who understand what I'm going through, and I understand what they're going through.
Yeah, I think that.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I just think that connection piece is so key, and I think that's a big reason why the protests lately are so powerful, right? Is because we're actually not supposed to be physically connecting, right? But we are making our way to do that because we have to. It's one of the ways that we survive, right? When there are a bunch of animals out to pasture and a storm comes, they all come together. And so that connection piece is just, I'm sure it's one of the things that's keeping us going, Yeah.
So maybe Lauren can answer, how does your racial and ethnic cultural background affect the work you do with clients that are potentially having racial trauma?
Yeah, I think because, and it sounds a little bit similar to Micah's work, which I think is not incredibly common, but because of my experience and background in anti-racist organizing and my own whiteness work, I do bring in race quite a bit for both my clients of color and my white clients. And I actually think that this is a practice that specifically white practitioners really aren't trained in any adequate way. And really the way that I have learned to engage with that in my practice is actually because of my organizing work outside of my training and counseling. And so, for me, it's a combination of really naming what's happening through a racialized lens. And doing that both for white clients and for clients of color. And then naming like my position in that. So I talk with my clients of color about what it's like to have a white practitioner, how that impacts our relationship, and try to create an opening where actually part of the racialized healing can happen between us, that I can hold space as a white person for the trauma of white people towards you, that you can call me out as a white person and I can engage with that with you really authentically in a solid way that can hold that, right? So in a sense, if I'm doing my work, that can be some racial healing for both of us. And it also means at the same time, making sure that this is a healing space that does not have to completely depend on this person's racial identity, right? That they can just be a human and going through what they're going through. So there's this fine balance kind of holding that sacred space and also naming the racial dynamics that are going on, including honoring when I may see actually a racist experience happening in that person's life, and maybe they're identifying it as internalized, right? So it's just coming out as self-doubt and confusion and self-hatred. And it's often my job then to name, actually, I'm curious if this lands for you as racism. Like, to me, this sounds like racism.
Yeah.
You're doing an excellent job at your job, and actually the white person is getting more acknowledgement. Like, let's look at how that plays out, right? But then also, I think another element that's really big for me, and in this time is actually even more accessible than it's really ever been, because my white clients are often bringing it to me now, but is working with white clients on like a lot of what Micah was talking about, which we tend to, talk about racialized trauma as like how to care for people of color who have experienced depression, which is incredibly important. But we rarely ever talk about like how to talk to white people about how whiteness impacts the way they operate. And so for me, a lot of the way I work with this is really to, again, name when I see something. Fragility comes up in our systems, in our own lives, right? Fragility is really about having a system that depends upon approval and constant achievement and being good at things and being seen as in a certain way. And when we're not seen that way, the system just collapses, right? And so a white person's healing around fragility has to do with their own life path and their own families, but it also has to do with race. And so it's my job actually often to acknowledge like, wow, I can see the tie here with what happened in your childhood, but I can also see the tie here with white culture and how whiteness raises us, right, with this level of personality fragility. And what it means actually not to coddle that, but to grow our container, to actually trust that there's a being in here that's worthy, that doesn't have to rely on these structures of whiteness, that can hold actually not being adequate at something, that can hold actually failing at something. So anyway, those are some of the ways, I really try to be targeted about bringing that through with white clients.
Good. I'm starting to wonder if I have the right questions in front of me, but hey, sorry. So what about, what does cultural competence mean with regard to therapy? Can one of you speak to that? What does it mean, and how does it impact working with someone that's been traumatized racially? Reina?
Sure. So I think when we talk about cultural competence, I think there's a really incredible intention behind that, but I think there's been a big shift to using the word cultural humility and what that really embodies in sort of like our relationship and in the ways that we're connecting with one another. And so, for instance, cultural competence sort of communicates that I might know enough about your cultural experience to work with you, or I do know enough about your cultural experience to work with you. Whereas cultural humility says, I recognize that your lived experience is yours and yours alone, and I can only be a witness to it and learn about it, right, as much as I can. But I will never be an expert in your lived experience. And I think this is really important when, like, we're working with, especially working with clients who have maybe oppressed identities that we don't hold, right, that we have to be open. And this is the same is true in our relationships and our friendships and our family relationships, right? We have different identity experiences within our families. So being open to learning and listening and being reflective about maybe some of the ways we might react or assumptions that we might have. I think like curiosity is a really important place to be. But I also think cultural humility is really important for me too. If I'm working with someone, a client of color, or if I'm talking to another biracial friend, so for me, my father is Black and my mother is white, but there are people out there whose fathers are Black and mothers are white or whatever, and they have really different lived experiences than I do. Mm-hmm. So if I can come with humility and openness and curiosity, that gets us a lot farther, right? And then the other person doesn't feel like they have to be on the defense about maybe something that we might bring if we're coming with the assumption that we are competent enough in their cultural experience.
That's not a term I'm familiar. I mean, I understand what it means. Mm-hmm. You hear much more about cultural competence as opposed to humility, and I think that would be a helpful term for folks because when you look at the idea of cultural competence, it already makes you feel like, am I okay enough? Do I understand enough? Am I competent to act?
It puts the pressure on.
Right. So the humility aspect turns inward, I guess,
Yeah.
Which I think is important.
I think, too, that the competence piece, and you kind of spoke to this, Reina, it implies that there's like an endpoint at which we've reached this. I'm finally competent. I can work with anybody now. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is really misleading. And actually what is required of us as practitioners, and for me, I'll speak for me as a white clinician, I need to first, and this is, I think, a part of cultural humility, is know my own culture and my own self, my own whiteness first. And with that, holding that I have a white worldview and a white perspective, and so that I need to come at it with humility and understanding that my experience is not going to be the same as my clients, and that it's a lifelong process of doing that. It's not that I'm going to reach a point at which I've achieved competence and now I'm good. It's like this lifelong process of learning and understanding.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. How do you as therapists work with folks who are like truly internally racially traumatized or have dealt with discrimination that's impacted their lives in an extremely negative way? How do you address that? Maybe Marna, do you want
to? Sure. I mean, it's different for each person that walks through the door. They're going to have, like both Micah and Reina have shared, that it's different for each person. And I mean, I find for myself is, validating their experience, whatever that may be, validating that what they have gone through is something that I can never understand because it would be different for me. The situation, completely different, similar feelings, but different situations. So validating the client's experiencing, and working with strategies that are reflective to what is culturally normative for that client. I work a lot with mixed race population, biracial, triracial. I'm familiar growing up as a, multiracial person. And so I can understand, but it's different. Mm-hmm. But I know the feeling of being in a liminal space racially. And coming up with reflective, normative, culturally normative practices for that client. And being aware of my own identity, and being transparent with my client. So they can be transparent and share and feel that they are in a safe space. But understanding that their experience is never going to be an experience that I can experience because it's different for everybody.
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add, I think, too, that I think it's when we think of, what am I trying to say? When we think about folks with trauma, I think if you're maybe outside of like a clinical setting or just sort of haven't had a hands-on experience with trauma, it might sound like we're talking about, when we talk about trauma and racialized trauma, that we're talking about people who are like really severely struggling, right? Mm-hmm. Or having difficulty functioning. And that can totally be the case. Yeah. But I also want to sort of normalize that most of us live with some type of trauma, some impacts of trauma, and that can look all different ways for us. So I just kind of want to normalize for people, if they're hearing this, that there's no, it just goes back to what Lauren was saying, right? There's no sort of definition of this counts as trauma and this doesn't. Mm-hmm. Whatever your experience is valid. And so you don't have to be, at rock bottom to seek support for trauma.
Sure. Absolutely.
And I might just add one thing there too, which is like I think in the way that trauma responses in the body can be similar, whether it's racialized or any other form of trauma, I think, there's often both a need for like resourcing, like what supports do you have in your life right now that bring you joy, that bring you relief, that bring you calm, and like surrounding self with those resources. And then also like space to grieve and rage. I do a lot of somatic counseling and with the goal of actually there being like a deep catharsis in the body where like, where my job becomes to like hold this space that there's deep emotional movement. And I find that like when like trauma gets stuck because it doesn't have space to be like held in the body fully and like felt fully and moved. And so giving a space for it to move, often in grief, often in rage, and creating a safe way to do that where someone can feel safe in their bodies as they really allow some of that movement. And then I also, in somatic counseling, we talk a little bit about the like kind of an access to an empowered body. Like, so I see part of the healing of trauma as getting to the state of, if I felt empowered in my being, what would that feel like in my body? And how would I move through my world in that body, right? And so I think there's many layers here, but in healing of trauma, I think those are some layers that I know I work on, that I know other counselors really hold space for along the path of healing racialized trauma, or really many forms of trauma.
Sounds like a critical aspect of it would be to really have this cathartic opportunity and just learn how to breathe and learn, whatever it is, that any kind of trauma that's really binding you up, I mean, I think we all can use that opportunity to just learn how to let things go, like you said, move through. And I think it's really valid. I keep hearing my phone going off, so I apologize about that. So we had, when we've talked before about anxiety and something, when we first brought up racial trauma in our last discussion, Marna had mentioned that she sees many of her clients, and including children, being hopeless. And I wondered, what does that look like in a person? What is, how does that evidence itself, and how are you able to counsel someone? Or any of you, or Marna specifically about the hopelessness, and maybe others can chime in about that kind of
and I do remember sharing that at the last meeting we had, panel we had. I see a lot of, particularly within young adult populations, where everything that is happening in the country, the world, with the pandemic, with the protests, with the police violence that's been going on, kids are experiencing, and young adults are experiencing, some form of a lot of depression, anxiety, panic, and this overall hopelessness feeling about the future. And it is meeting them where they're at, number one, because I don't know what the future holds for anybody. I don't think anybody does. And acknowledging that their feelings are valid. But it is working with them and helping them move through. I think Lauren and Micah and Reina have all spoke to this about being able to move through it. You won't be able to, erase it from your memory, but you'll be able to move through it so that you can function and focus on school, work, whatever. But it is a pattern that I'm seeing, and I'm seeing a lot of changes in eating habits, eating patterns, and sleep patterns, concentration, some self-injury behaviors, trying to deal with all of these feelings that are inside.
Does anyone else have anything to add about that, of how they can assist someone who's experiencing any really broad trauma, broad types of trauma?
So when I was, I think Marna just saying like how important it is to really honor what it is like, and that it's so valid to feel those ways and to be experiencing those things, that actually like that's your system being wise, saying like, this is not okay, this is not safe. Like that is the wisdom of your being telling you that through your nervous system. It's like right and smart. And one of the things that I'm grateful for in some of my like spiritual psychology training is work around, like when it comes to hopelessness, I find that sometimes some support for that can be like a little bit of ancestral work. And so actually having some real like sacred space, walking through a kind of a meditative or active imagination or visualization of connecting to ancestors. And I find that for those of us, no matter like what our religious background or spiritual background or not, that there is like kind of an embodied thing that happens when we're able to connect with a sense of history that belongs to us, with a sense of lineage. And I encourage clients even to go back and look into their lineage. Like, what did your ancestors do? How did they resist? How did they show up to racialized trauma? How, what stories live in you actually that can guide you to feeling like you have a purpose in this time, that actually you are, you know, alive in your body and you carry the wisdom of your ancestors and you carry their strength and you carry their vision, and what does it look like for you to feel a sense of like purpose. And I do find that, again, like that has to be, it can sound so like, it really has to come deep from a well within them, right? It's not the therapist saying, I believe in you, you have purpose. It's really saying like, what's deep in your bones as far as your connections to ancestry, and what kind of guidance does that bring you? So that's just this one way that I sometimes work with hopelessness around, you know, really social trauma, cultural trauma.
Sounds like a lot of self-reflection, excuse me, that you encourage, and then with the ancestral aspect to it, that's what it sounds like is like really reaching into what you know of your history and taking the strength that you can, or lessons that you can from what you know of your own history, and moving forward with that.
Yeah,
sounds
and
simple enough.
Too, when I think about, you know, I'm having a lot of white clients coming in with like, oh my gosh, like I have so much to learn and I have to undo all this stuff, and like I'm, you know, and it's like, good, this is great to have white clients coming in with this. This is really good. Mm-hmm. But you know, one of the things I say is, even if it's not your ancestor, there are white ancestors who've done anti-racist work. Like find some of them. You know, Anne Braden is a great one, and she wrote a book. So you know, like find white ancestors who showed up to anti-racist work in a really grounded and impactful way, and call them in as ancestors, right? To give you some guidance and hope. So even just to name, like, it doesn't have to be your ancestors necessarily, but you do want to feel like some connection, you know, in your veins, and find that inspiration there.
That sounds like a great way to move forward. So again, this was a question. I don't know if it made the original cut, but it's on my paper. So I know that teachers and other professionals, educators, you know, we like the idea of cultural competence is something that has been presented in that manner, but what can we do to equip educators and teachers to with kids, I guess, in trauma in general, but whether it's racial trauma or just trauma, how can educators be better equipped for working with young people? Does anyone?
I think that I'm sorry, Micah, were you going to say something?
And wait, go ahead. I'll go after.
No, go ahead. I'll go after you. Go for it.
Okay, I was just going to say that I'm not an educator, so I don't know that I can speak to specifically educators. But I think that right now, in general, a lot of white folks we're asking ourselves that questions, like what should I be doing, or what can I be doing? And when we're talking about holding space for people of color and Black and Indigenous people, that we need to, again, like, be sure that we're doing the work for ourselves in understanding whiteness, and focusing on understanding how, for me, like, white body supremacy shows up for me in my relationships, how it shows up in work. I think there can be such an impulse for us to want to diversify an environment and make sure that we're doing all the right things, and we tend as white folks to skip that step of, like, looking at ourselves and what understanding white supremacy as understanding our role in it, and as our responsibility to be dismantling those systems. And that starts with, like, understanding and doing the work for ourselves, on ourselves, I mean. And in education, I think, I guess one thing that comes to mind about the way that we learn about systems of oppression is it's often like siphoned off to some separate class and some separate training where we learn that like, you know, we might have a class that's focused on working with people of color, for example. And rather than doing that, we need to have those conversations centered in every single class. If we're educators, that conversation needs to be centered in every single meeting, not just something that we come to when something like the murder of a Black man happens, right? Like we need to be centering that all of the time. Yeah, that's just what comes up for me.
Yeah. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, definitely good points. I think that focusing on how we teach, I don't teach. I am, I do provide some instruction on how to choose culturally responsive books for teachers, for educators. And I think that Micah said the key is understanding the teachers themselves, looking at themselves and understanding their own beliefs, their own biases, their privileges, and their responses to those students that they're working with. And recognizing, and I think this is important, that persons from who are the same members of the same racial or ethnic group have different experiences, have different emotions, will respond to things differently, and to be careful not to generalize about an entire group. I think it's hard when you've got a classroom and I don't know how many, let's say if we're talking elementary or junior, senior high, how many kids are in a class anymore? I'm thinking they may have a large group of varying ethnicities of students in that class, and not to generalize, a whole population based on what their understanding is of that population, and let the kids kind of teach them, empower them to be the leaders in some of these discussions. And like I said, I'm not a teacher, so there are lots of resources, but understanding and looking at themselves first. And I like the way that Micah, stated that, especially that, as well as how the content of what they're teaching. It should be in every classroom. It shouldn't just be siphoned off as it was shared that it's in a different classroom. It should be in every classroom.
Totally. Yes. Go ahead.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think too, along with that reflection of the ways that your own privileged and if you're a white teacher, right, white body supremacy or whatever your identities are, like however that shows up in the classroom, in those like one-on-one conversations with students, all those little exchanges. I think it's also important to recognize that you are also dealing with vicarious trauma if you have students in your classroom who are experiencing or have experienced trauma. And that's maybe not a job you signed up for, but it's now part of your role. And so thinking about the ways that you can take care of yourself, because that's also going to influence your teaching and even just down to your level of patience, right? I'm actually going to put in a plug. In a few weeks, I'll be co-facilitating a training with a educator friend of mine on we're still coming up with a title, but essentially trauma-informed educational practices during this time. So stay tuned. That will also obviously be online and should be free to access.
Very cool. Thanks.
Very cool.
Before we're going to be talking about how to do, some anti-racist work that we can that we have in the community and other resources. But you've all mentioned white body supremacy. So could someone define what that means exactly? So, Micah, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, when I think of, I think that many of us have been conditioned to think of white supremacy as looking like someone who is in the KKK and who ascribes to beliefs that whiteness is superior. And what I've been learning a lot about is that that sure is one form of it, but actually white supremacy is interwoven throughout all of our systems and also all of us as humans, and that that it can show up in different ways for each of us. I think of like for me, understanding that I've been conditioned to think of white folks and whiteness as being superior and as being like the standard of beauty, for example. And so many of the messaging that I have received and taken in, I may not believe it cognitively, and I may be able to pick out like, no, that's not true, but my body still responds to that messaging in a way, and that if I am not paying attention to it, and even sometimes when I am, I still miss it. I will still act from that space of white supremacy and cause harm to the people of color in my life. And so that's what I think for me that means, is just recognizing that white supremacy is infused in all of our systems, and it's also lives in us as humans. And for me, like, I need to understand, I've started thinking about it in terms of like an internal family systems perspective, that I have a white supremacist part, and getting to know that part for myself and understand how it shows up. Yeah, and I think it helps me to remember that it's not a cognitive game, and it can be like, I need to understand the cognitive pieces, but it really comes down to like knowing that it's infused in my body in a way that that it takes, like Reina's talking about Resmamenicum, and he talks about his work is designed around this idea of it living in our bodies, and that we need to be working with each other to heal that in our bodies, and that it's not a cognitive switch that we can turn on and off. It's work that we need to do somatically.
Wow. Very interesting.
I will just add an example. I think that was a brilliantly done description. And just an example that I think about a lot actually is with my white male clients. Often, what we see a lot and don't talk about a lot is white men having actually like deep feelings of isolation and inadequacy that are like lead to just like a lot of depression amongst white men. And I really like look at this as a whiteness thing, that white men are raised to both like be able to constantly achieve, and are then like, if they do certain things, they do achieve in this culture, in this whiteness culture that makes achievement for white boys basically like not having many emotions, not being vulnerable, not feeling feelings of weakness, always knowing the answer. And no human is capable of any of those things. And so white men feel deeply inadequate and isolated in that experience, and yet are constantly working to keep that experience going. And because all of these pieces of themselves have to be rejected in order to sustain that, the way that white supremacy in that person's body then kind of what Resma says, like blows into black bodies, is by saying black body emotion is not okay, right? Like is inappropriate, is to be belittled, because whiteness is forcing me to do that in my own system. So when I see it in a black body, not only is it like all of the racialized history of this country that sees like Black expression as actually as threatening to white power, to the like power of whiteness, but not only that, but it's deeply personal, right? For a white man to see the expression of emotion, both in a Black body and in a being, and to outright reject that, right? And to reject that according to standards of white supremacy, which are like unfeeling, dissociated, achievement, production oriented, right? And so those things are so tied. And so just to kind of bridge that example that, Micah was saying, that seems like that's no KKK. That's like, the Ann Arbor mayor, actually, right? Yeah. Truly, who's very progressive and who, quotes right fragility, but actually deeply has that issue in his body, where he's constantly rejecting expressions of emotions from Black people in our community and demeaning them. So again, like that's I think just a good example of how subtle this can be. Yeah. And he's not a KKK, right? We're not part of white supremacist thing.
It is real subtle, and I'm sure not even understood that it's happening, in the person's body, even in my own. If I were to project something like that, it's not intentional, but there's a lot of work to do. So how about does anyone have anything else before we move on to potential, maybe it's not solutions, but it's ways that we can move forward and share resources with our audience? But anything else about trauma or white body supremacy, anything like that you want to share? Okay.
I just want to remind Black and Indigenous and people of color that they have inherent value. And I want to invite you, when you find yourself doubting yourself, thinking negative thoughts, experiencing icky things, to just remind yourself of that value and how whatever it is that sort of brings you into yourself. Like, hand on my heart is often it for me, right? Like so much of the pain that we experience now is can be contextualized through history, right? The kind of the things that we struggle with are rarely individual issues, and so they can't be reduced to thoughts about whether we're worthy or good enough or functioning or whatever. So I just want to extend that to folks.
Very good. Yeah, that's appreciated for everyone. So one of the reasons you all have something great to share with us for this panel. I know Lauren had indicated that you do some anti-racist work. Can you tell us something about that and what our audience might be able to pursue locally?
Yeah, that's a more complex question than one would think. I think in part because, like, as Mike is sharing, like, there's so many layers to this work. That really, like, organizing is one of those layers. But doing our internalized work is a really important part of that layer, especially if we want to show up in ways where, I was going to say where we won't be harmful, but where we might minimize the harm, and when we do enact harm, we're receptive to that, and we learn, and we have the stability to be able to move through that process. So I would say anti-racist organizing is really complex, and white people hold a very specific, kind of space in that, which is that we're both really needed, actually, to be able to bring this to whiteness and to dismantle white supremacy through white bodies. And also, like, it's really important, actually, that this is a space where Black voices and Indigenous voices and people of color are lifted up and leading the charge and guiding and really have always guided that work. And so, I would say to really just like start having conversations to kind of both like, show up, but really show up to learn and show up to be guided. And of course, maybe Marna and Reina could speak to people of color, joining movement spaces or as we've talked about a little bit, that actually, organizing, protesting actually is a form of healing right now. And I really believe that actually. It's one of the things that sustains me in the work for sure, is actually working with other anti-racist organizers. So there's different groups happening right now. There's an abolitionist group working on mass incarceration called Liberate, Don't Incarcerate. That's also been doing a lot of work around the prosecutor campaign in Washington County. So I'm actually part of that team. So I totally check out our website. There's some really good stuff there. There's some people working on and have worked on police oversight, police accountability in Ann Arbor area. I know there's activity around that in Ypsi as well. So, it's just start talking to people if you're interested in showing up in some way, and try to spend a long time learning. Like, there's history in this county of this work going back a long time. So if you're just starting to plug in, you want to take a long time just to get a sense of who's here, who's been showing up, what work have they been doing. As you do your internalized work, learn a lot about what's happening here, and you can start to plug in ways that are going to serve our community. There is a lot happening. Just kind of move slowly, get to know it, show up, put your body on the line, and then, really take in and learn. And it'd be some thoughts there if others have things to add.
Okay. Yeah. Does anyone have anything to add? We can add the website and maybe even what you were talking about, Reina, what you're doing on our resources that once this gets goes live. Is that all good?
Yeah.
There was, I don't know. Oh, I guess vicarious trauma. I don't know if we wanted to talk about any more on the resource end of it. But the term vicarious trauma, Reina mentioned it, and so I apologize that I'm looping back. But like, say a person's observing, so even like the George Floyd murder, and repeatedly, and every time you see it, or even just taking the 8.5 minutes to acknowledge it is painful. Like at the other day, I was at a protest. So I wonder, like, if empathy has a play in some of this kind of internalization of what's going on. Does that make sense? Like, if an empathic person may also be vicariously traumatized, by some of these things. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think that there are some of our nervous systems run more sensitively, and so some of us might be a little more spongy when it comes to being with other people who have trauma. But I also think in so many of the ways that we've described, whether it's what we lean into and recoil from, or whether it's, right, like how Micah's sort of framed it, not as necessarily a cognitive game. I love that. I wrote that down. I think like that vicarious trauma stuff can happen on a subtle level as well. So, and I actually think that things like empathy and compassion can be keys to coping with vicarious trauma, because it acknowledges maybe that the pain is there instead of instead of walling us off to something like, oh man, this just happened. I just interacted with this child, if I'm a teacher, right, or whatever, and I'm just going to walk away from that now, versus like, let me lean into this a little bit more and be curious about this. So I think it's a balance between, I think empathy can be ruinous, but also we can't be without it.
Ruinous because?
So I think sometimes maybe the same folks who, like I said, kind of run with that, like, a little more sensitive nervous system, or, I mean, I know this is true for me as a social worker. I'm sure the other three panelists here have had this experience of feeling so empathetic and so drawn to help and fix and say the right thing. Or, I mean, this happens for me in therapy a lot. I want to rescue my clients when I see them struggling. And I have to kind of allow them to, I could throw a life jacket out, right? But I can't necessarily jump in the water with them. That's not my role. So, and I think that's actually something we're going to talk about in the workshop I'm running in a couple of weeks, is the level and the type of support and responsiveness that you provide. It has got to be couched within the scope of your role.
No, that's a very good. Yeah, no, I was going to say that's a very good point, Reina. And I think that, I mean, because I just did a training for the University of Ottawa on trauma-informed librarianship, which is the big thing. I'm sure you've heard of this, Beth. And we've talked about compassion fatigue as a result of vicarious trauma, because just like Reina said, I've experienced it too, where it's just like you want to rescue your clients and you can't. It's like that, and I'm assuming that everybody's been on an airplane where they do the little okay, this is what happens when the little bag falls out. And they always tell you, take care of you first, then put the thing on your, whoever is sitting next to you who can't do it for them. And we get into a place where it's like we're exposed to all of the, we're hearing trauma as clinicians, sometimes on a weekly basis, monthly basis, yearly basis, and we're exposed to that. And it is hard, because sometimes you'll experience the same things that your clients are experiencing. And is learning to kind of not let yourself get burned out. And it's just like people who are watching, all of the protesting going on. We're still in a pandemic. There's things happening in other countries that we are watching, reading, sharing. Social media is just sending this stuff out so fast that we're kind of traumatizing ourselves over and over again. And it's learning how to practice good self-care.
I think it's, were you done?
Go ahead.
No, I was just
I'm done.
Important, but yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add to, I think that like ruinous empathy piece is really important for, in the context of this conversation, white people to think about, right? Because when you start to become aware of all the injustice and the harm that's happening, you might feel like you've got to make up for it in some way, right? Or that if you can just do the right thing, then you're going to feel better and somebody else is going to know that you're not racist. And so it's really important that everybody, and especially white people, can tolerate the discomfort of like, some people might be kind of mad at me right now, or right, I cannot jump in and fix this. I cannot talk to the manager and get whatever taken off of the bill.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Reina. I was thinking about how different I might answer or respond to how to navigate the like overwhelming amount of information that's happening right now, depending on what the racial identity is of the person navigating it, right? And for me, speaking for myself and also with white clients, like part of our job that Marna M talks about is for us as white folks to build our nervous systems and strengthen our nervous system so that we can tolerate that discomfort more, because traditionally what we have done and what like a major aspect of white body supremacy is in just shutting off and tuning out and freezing and not and ignoring essentially. And so and if we're not taking the time to practice sitting with that discomfort and learning how to self-soothe in ways that like soothe our nervous system, but then lean back into that discomfort and sit with it again, then we can, we tend to gravitate more to just zoning out and not engaging with it. And our work as white folks is to be doing that more. Yeah, I feel like there was something else I was going to say, but I lost it. Yeah.
I do think that's so important that actually this is so, the answer to this is so different based on your identities. And, you know, like I think about the Audre Lorde quote, like caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And I really think that that is true for people of color, especially in this moment, and always has been and is heightened now, right? That like actually it can be an act of resistance to take care of your being if you're a Black person or person of an Indigenous person, a person of color. And I do think for white people, it's actually what I call like expanding our container. It's actually expanding what we're capable of holding. And that's actually our job. I remember I watched this powerful interview with Vance Jones and a woman who runs Sounds True, which is a kind of a spiritual hub of podcasting and books and all, you know, teachers. And she said something like, basically like, what happens if I just get really anxious all the time around this stuff? And I just, like, my spiritual practice has been to not feel anxious and has been based on actually settling my system. And he said something along the lines of like, do you not think that like all the Black people on the front lines don't experience anxiety? Like, do you think they're not anxious? Like, what do you think is in their bodies? And they're still showing up there and they're still doing the work. And I think that's really powerful. I think a lot of healing work for white people has been centered around this self-soothing. I think actually the challenge now is like, how do we actually grow our capacity to hold our anxiety and that we're still showing up? Like, how do we hold that we're going to mess up and like, we're still really clear about our role, right? Like, we have to just have a bigger capacity for this work right now.
Sounds like just the important work and just maintaining like a holistic sense of oneself and acknowledging. And I think this is where I know there's a lot of people, you know, trying and engaging in the space, white people in particular, but there's still a lot that just aren't on the same page, and that, you know, that don't have the capacity to seek and learn. But anyway, I don't want to. It's just knowing that those folks are still out there. It makes the work challenging, as you know. But I do hope that the more we talk about it and the more we're able to identify it, that our community members can grow a little as well, you know.
And one way I think just to encourage that, again, is this tie to trauma and like actually whiteness trauma in white bodies, like being dissociated, being incapable of having capacity to feel like we're solidly grounded human that can hold lots of things doesn't feel good in our bodies either, right? Like, so just to suggest that sometimes through that trauma lens of actually how is your avoidance of this actually a form of dissociation, and how does dissociation feel in your body, and doesn't that feel terrible in your body? And actually you kind of feel terrible in your body right now all the time, right? And like, oh, so actually being able to relate to this in a new way is actually healing for you, right? So that's a layer that you can't always get into in a Facebook comment. But some of this other healing work may be into that system.
And it could be a goal. But that's great insight. I think that we can wrap this up. Does anyone have anything else to add to this conversation that's been extremely robust and helpful, and I appreciate. Any parting words?
I just wanted to offer a resource that for clinicians that I just learned of a Black woman who's a social worker, I think in Baltimore. Her name is Shauna Murray Brown, and she has a webinar right now that's available called 6 Steps to Decolonize Your Therapy Practice. It was really good, and I believe she's also right now engaging in a longer program to go deeper into what she presents in that webinar that I think will be available online also. So.
Okay.
No, I agree. I am familiar with that webinar. Thank you. And I also think that there's a lot of resources at public libraries, academic libraries. They all have, these resource guides that a lot of clinicians, the public, can access to be able to kind of pinpoint resources and readings that may be helpful.
That sounds good. Yeah, we'll post, if you would email me that stuff, we can figure that out later. But so I want to, again, thank you, the 4 of you, for joining us in this really interesting conversation. And I look forward to seeing if we're able to collaborate again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.